Section 4 of A Little Tour of France by Henry James. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 7. We never went to Chinon. It was a fatality. We planned it a dozen times, but the weather interfered, or the trains didn't suit, or one of the party was fatigued with the adventures of the day before. This excursion was so much postponed that it was finally postponed to everything. Besides, we had to go to Chenonceaux, to Azay-le-Rideau, to Langeais, to Loches, so I have not the memory of Chinon, I have only the regret. But regret as well as memory has its visions, especially when, like memory, it is assisted by photographs. The castle of Chinon in this form appears to me as an enormous ruin, a medieval fortress, of the extent almost of a city. It covers a hill above the Vienne, and after being impregnable in its time, is indestructible today. I risk this phrase in the face of the prosaic truth. Chinon, in the days when it was a prize, more than once suffered capture, and at present it is crumbling inch by inch. It is apparent, however, I believe, that these inches encroach little upon acres of masonry. It was in the castle that Jeanne d'Arc had her first interview with Charles VII., and it is in the town that Francois Rabelais is supposed to have been born. To the castle, moreover, the lover of the picturesque is earnestly recommended to direct his steps. But one cannot do everything, and I would rather have missed Chinon than Chenonceaux. Fortunate exceedingly were the few hours that we passed at this exquisite residence. In 1747, says Jean-Jacques Rousseau in his Confessions, we went to spend the autumn in Touraine at the chateau of Chenonceaux, a royal residence upon the Cher, built by Henry II for Diana of Poitiers, whose initials are still to be seen there, and now in possession of M. Dupin, the farmer general. We amused ourselves greatly in this fine spot. The living was of the best, and I became fat as a monk. We made a great deal of music, and acted comedies. This is the only description that Rousseau gives of one of the most romantic houses in France, and of an episode that must have counted as one of the most agreeable in his uncomfortable career. The 18th century contented itself with general epithets, and when Jean-Jacques has said that Chenonceaux was a beau lieu, he thinks himself absolved from further characterization. We later sons of time have, both for our pleasure and our pain, invented the fashion of special terms, and I am afraid that even common decency obliges me to pay some larger tribute than this to the architectural gem of Touraine. Fortunately, I can discharge my debt with gratitude. In going from Tours, you leave the valley of the Loire and enter that of the Cher, and at the end of about an hour you see the turrets of the castle on your right among the trees, down in the meadows beside the quiet little river. The station and the village are about 10 minutes' walk from the chateau, and the village contains a very tidy inn, where, if you are not in too great a hurry to commune with the shades of the royal favourite and the jealous queen, you will perhaps stop and order a dinner to be ready for you in the evening. A straight, tall avenue leads to the grounds of the castle. What I owe to exactitude compels me to add that it is crossed by the railway line. The place is so arranged, however, that the chateau need know nothing of passing trains, which pass, indeed, though the grounds are not large, at a very sufficient distance. I may add that the trains throughout this part of France have a noiseless, desultory, dawdling, almost stationary quality, which makes them less of an offence than usual. It was a Sunday afternoon, and the light was yellow, save under the trees of the avenue, where, in spite of the waning of September, it was duskily green. 3 or 4 peasants in festal attire were strolling about. On a bench at the beginning of the avenue sat a man with 2 women. As I advanced with my companions, he rose, after a sudden stare, and approached me with a smile in which, to be Johnsonian for a moment, certitude was mitigated by modesty, and eagerness was embellished with respect. He came toward me with a salutation that I had seen before, and I am happy to say that after an instant I ceased to be guilty of the brutality of not knowing where. There was only one place in the world where people smile like that, only one place where the art of salutation has that perfect grace. This excellent creature used to crook his arm, in Venice, when I stepped into my gondola, and I now laid my hand on that member with the familiarity of glad recognition; for it was only surprise that had kept me even for a moment from accepting the genial Francesco as an ornament of the landscape of Touraine. What on earth, the phrase is the right one, was a Venetian gondolier doing at Chenonceaux? He had been brought from Venice, gondola and all, by the mistress of the charming house, to paddle about on the Cher. Our meeting was affectionate, though there was a kind of violence in seeing him so far from home. He was too well dressed, too well fed; he had grown stout, and his nose had the tinge of good claret. He remarked that the life of the household to which he had the honor to belong was that of a casa regia, which must have been a great change for poor Checco, whose habits in Venice were not regal. Otherwise he was the sympathetic Checco still, and for 5 minutes after I left him I thought less about the little pleasure house by the Cher than about the palaces of the Adriatic. But attention was not long in coming round to the charming structure that presently rose before us. The pale yellow front of the chateau, the small scale of which is at first a surprise, rises beyond a considerable court, at the entrance of which a massive and detached round tower with a turret on its brow, a relic of the building that preceded the actual villa, appears to keep guard. The court is not enclosed, or is enclosed at least only by the gardens, portions of which are at present in a state of violent reformation. Therefore, though Chenonceaux has no great height, its delicate facade stands up boldly enough. This facade, one of the most finished things in Touraine, consists of 2 stories surmounted by an attic, which, as so often in the buildings of the French Renaissance, is the richest part of the house. The high-pitched roof contains 3 windows of beautiful design, covered with embroidered caps and flowering into crocketed spires. The window above the door is deeply niched. It opens up upon a balcony made in the form of a double pulpit, one of the most charming features of the front. Chenonceaux is not large, as I say, but into its delicate compass is packed a great deal of history, history which differs from that of Amboise and Blois in being of the private and sentimental kind. The echoes of the place, faint and far as they are today, are not political but personal. Chenonceaux dates, as a residence, from the year 1515, when the shrewd Thomas Bohier, a public functionary who had grown rich in handling the finances of Normandy, had acquired the estate from a family which, after giving it many feudal lords, had fallen into poverty, erected the present structure on the foundations of an old mill. The design is attributed, with I know not what justice, to Pierre Nepveu, alias Trinqueau, the audacious architect of Chambord. On the death of Bohier, the house passed to his son, who, however, was forced, under cruel pressure, to surrender it to the crown, in compensation for a so-called deficit in the accounts of the late superintendent of the treasury. Francis I. held the place till his death, but Henry II., on ascending the throne, presented it out of hand to that mature charmer, the admired of 2 generations, Diana of Poitiers. Diana enjoyed it till the death of her protector, but when this event occurred, the widow of the monarch, who had been obliged to submit in silence for years to the ascendency of a rival, took the most pardonable of all revenges with which the name of Catherine de' Medici is associated, and turned her out of doors. Diana was not in want of refuges, and Catherine went through the form of giving her Chaumont in exchange, but there was only one Chenonceaux. Catherine devoted herself to making the place more completely unique. The feature that renders it sole of its kind is not appreciated till you wander round to either side of the house. If a certain springing lightness is the characteristic of Chenonceaux, if it bears in every line the aspect of a place of recreation, a place intended for delicate, chosen pleasures, nothing can confirm this expression better than the strange, unexpected movement with which, from behind, it carries itself across the river. The earlier building stands in the water. It had inherited the foundations of the mill destroyed by Thomas Bohier. The first step, therefore, had been taken upon solid piles of masonry, and the ingenious Catherine, she was a raffinée, simply proceeded to take the others. She continued the piles to the opposite bank of the Cher, and over them she threw a long, straight gallery of 2 stories. This part of the chateau, which looks simply like a house built upon a bridge and occupying its entire length, is, of course, the great curiosity of Chenonceaux. It forms on each floor a charming corridor, which, within, is illuminated from either side by the flickering river light. The architecture of these galleries, seen from without, is less elegant than that of the main building, but the aspect of the whole thing is delightful. I have spoken of Chenonceaux as a villa, using the word advisedly, for the place is neither a castle nor a palace. It is a very exceptional villa, but it has the villa quality, the look of being intended for life in common. This look is not at all contradicted by the wing across the Cher, which only suggests intimate pleasures, as the French say, walks in pairs on rainy days, games and dances on autumn nights, together with as much as may be of moonlighted dialogue, or silence, in the course of evenings more genial still, in the well-marked recesses of windows. It is safe to say that such things took place there in the last century, during the kindly reign of Monsieur and Madame Dupin. This period presents itself as the happiest in the annals of Chenonceaux. I know not what festive train the great Diana may have led, and my imagination, I am afraid, is only feebly kindled by the records of the luxurious pastimes organized on the banks of the Cher by the terrible daughter of the Medici, whose appreciation of the good things of life was perfectly consistent with the failure to perceive why others should live to enjoy them. The best society that ever assembled there was collected at Chenonceaux during the middle of the 18th century. This was surely, in France at least, the age of good society, the period when it was well for appreciative people to have been born. Such people should, of course, have belonged to the fortunate few, and not to the miserable many; for the prime condition of a society being good is that it be not too large. The 60 years that preceded the French Revolution were the golden age of fireside talk, and of those pleasures which proceeded from the presence of women in whom the social art is both instinctive and acquired. The women of that period were, above all, good company. The fact is attested by 1,000 documents. Chenonceaux offered a perfect setting to free conversation, and infinite joyous discourse must have mingled with the liquid murmur of the Cher. Claude Dupin was not only a great man of business, but a man of honor and a patron of knowledge, and his wife was gracious, clever, and wise. They had acquired this famous property by purchase from one of the Bourbons, for Chenonceaux for 2 centuries after the death of Catherine de' Medici remained constantly in princely hands, and it was transmitted to their son, Dupin de Francueil, grandfather of Madame Georges Sand. This lady, in her correspondence, lately published, describes a visit that she paid more than 30 years ago to those members of her family who were still in possession. The owner of Chenonceaux today is the daughter of an Englishman naturalized in France. But I have wandered far from my story, which is simply a sketch of the surface of the place. Seen obliquely from either side, in combination with its bridge and gallery, the chateau is singular and fantastic, a striking example of a wilful and capricious conception. Unfortunately, all caprices are not so graceful and successful, and I grudge the honor of this one to the false and blood-polluted Catherine. To be exact, I believe the arches of the bridge were laid by the elderly Diana. It was Catherine, however, who completed the monument. Within, the house has been, as usual, restored. The staircases and ceilings, in all the old royal residences of this part of France, are the parts that have suffered least. Many of them have still much of the life of the old time about them. Some of the chambers of Chenonceaux, however, encumbered as they are with modern detail, derive a sufficiently haunted and suggestive look from the deep setting of their beautiful windows, which thickens the shadows and makes dark corners. There is a charming little Gothic chapel, with its apse hanging over the water, fastened to the left flank of the house. Some of the upper balconies, which look along the outer face of the gallery, and either up or down the river, are delightful protected nooks. We walked through the lower gallery to the other bank of the Cher. This fine apartment appeared to be for the moment a purgatory of ancient furniture. It terminates rather abruptly; it simply stops with a blank wall. There ought, of course, to have been a pavilion here, though I prefer very much the old defect to any modern remedy. The wall is not so blank, however, but that it contains a door which opens on a rusty drawbridge. This drawbridge traverses the small gap which divides the end of the gallery from the banks of the stream. The house, therefore, does not literally rest on opposite edges of the Cher, but rests on one and just fails to rest on the other. The pavilion would have made that up, but after a moment we ceased to miss this imaginary feature. We passed the little drawbridge and wandered a while beside the river. From this opposite bank the mass of the chateau looked more charming than ever, and the little peaceful, lazy Cher, where 2 or 3 men were fishing in the eventide, flowed under the clear arches and between the solid pedestals of the part that spanned it, with the softest, vaguest light on its bosom. This was the right perspective. We were looking across the river of time. The whole scene was deliciously mild. The moon came up. We passed back through the gallery and strolled about a little longer in the gardens. It was very still. I met my old gondolier in the twilight. He showed me his gondola, but I hated somehow to see it there. I don't like, as the French say, to meuler le genre. A gondola in a little flat French river? The image was not less irritating, if less injurious, than the spectacle of a steamer in the Grand Canal, which had driven me away from Venice a year and a half before. We took our way back to the Grand Monarque, and waited in the little inn parlour for a late train to Tours. We were not impatient, for we had an excellent dinner to occupy us, and even after we had dined we were still content to sit a while and exchange remarks upon the superior civilization of France. Where else, at a village inn, should we have fared so well? Where else should we have sat down to our refreshment without condescension? There were 2 or 3 countries in which it would not have been happy for us to arrive hungry on a Sunday evening at so modest a hostelry. At the little inn at Chenonceaux the cuisine was not only excellent, but the service was graceful. We were waited on by mademoiselle and her mamma. It was so that mademoiselle alluded to the elder lady, as she uncorked for us a bottle of Vouvray mousseux. We were very comfortable, very genial. We even went so far as to say to each other that Vouvray mousseux was a delightful wine. From this opinion, indeed, one of our trio differed, but this member of the party had already exposed herself to the charge of being too fastidious by declining to descend from the carriage at Chaumont and take that backstairs view of the castle. Chapter 8. Without fastidiousness, it was fair to declare, on the other hand, that the little inn at Azay-le-Rideau was very bad. It was terribly dirty, and it was in charge of a fat megere whom the appearance of 4 trustful travellers (we were 4, with an illustrious 4th on that occasion) roused apparently to fury. I attached great importance to this incongruous hostess, for she uttered the only uncivil words I heard spoken, in connection with any business of my own, during a tour of some 6 weeks in France. Breakfast not at Azay-le-Rideau, therefore, too trustful traveller, or if you do so, be either very meek or very bold. Breakfast not, save under stress of circumstance, but let no circumstance whatever prevent you from going to see the admirable chateau, which is almost a rival of Chenonceaux. The village lies close to the gates, though after you pass these gates you leave it well behind. A little avenue, as at Chenonceaux, leads to the house, making a pretty vista as you approach the sculptured doorway. Azay is a most perfect and beautiful thing. I should place it 3rd in any list of the great houses of this part of France, in which these houses should be ranked according to charm. For beauty of detail it comes after Blois and Chenonceau, but it comes before Amboise and Chambord. On the other hand, of course, it is inferior in majesty to either of these vast structures. Like Chenonceau, it is a watery place, though it is more meagrely moated than the little chateau on the Cher. It consists of a large square cour de logis, with a round tower at each angle, rising out of a somewhat too slumberous pond. The water of the Indre, surrounds it, but it is only on one side that it bathes its feet in the moat. On one of the others there is a little terrace, treated as a garden, and in front there is a wide court formed by a wing, which on the right comes forward. This front, covered with sculptures, is of the richest, stateliest effect. The court is approached by a bridge over the pond, and the house would reflect itself in this wealth of water if the water were a trifle less opaque. But there is a certain stagnation, it affects more senses than one, about the picturesque pools of Azay. On the hither side of the bridge is a garden, overshadowed by fine old sycamores, a garden shut in by greenhouses and by a fine last-century gateway flanked with twin lodges. Beyond the chateau, and the standing waters behind it, is a so-called parc, which, however, it must be confessed, has little of park-like beauty. The old houses, many of them, that is, remain in France, but the old timber does not remain, and the denuded aspect of the few acres that surround the chateaux of Touraine is pitiful to the traveller who has learned to take the measure of such things from the manors and castles of England. The domain of the lordly Chaumont is that of an English suburban villa, and in that and other places there is little suggestion, in the untended aspect of walk and lawns, of the vigilant British gardener. The manor of Azay, as seen to day, dates from the early part of the 16th century, and the industrious Abbe Chevalier, in his very entertaining, though slightly rose-colored book on Touraine, Promenade pittoresque en Touraine, Tours, 1869, speaks of it as perhaps the purest expression of the belle Renaissance Francaise. Its height, he goes on, is divided between two stories, terminating under the roof in a projecting entablature which imitates a row of machicolations. Carven chimneys and tall dormer windows, covered with imagery, rise from the roofs. Turrets on brackets of elegant shape hang with the greatest lightness from the angles of the building. The soberness of the main lines, the harmony of the empty spaces and those that are filled out, the prominence of the crowning parts, the delicacy of all the details, constitute an enchanting whole. And then the abbe speaks of the admirable staircase which adorns the north front, and which, with its extension inside, constitutes the principal treasure of Azay. The staircase passes beneath one of the richest of the porticos, a portico over which a monumental salamander indulges in the most decorative contortions. The sculptured vaults of stone which cover the windings of the staircase within, the fruits, flowers, ciphers, heraldic signs, are of the noblest effect. The interior of the chateau is rich, comfortable, extremely modern, but it makes no picture that compares with its external face, about which, with its charming proportions, its profuse yet not extravagant sculpture, there is something very tranquil and pure. I took particular fancy to the roof, high, steep, old, with its slope of bluish slate, and the way the weather-worn chimneys seem to grow out of it like living things out of a deep soil. The only defect of the house is the blankness and bareness of its walls, which have none of those delicate parasites attached to them that one likes to see on the surface of old dwellings. It is true that this bareness results in a kind of silvery whiteness of complexion, which carries out the tone of the quiet pools and even that of the scanty and shadeless park. End of section 4.